Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kashish Tomar, and I am currently a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I have the honor of serving as the Master of Ceremony for today's event. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm and humble welcome to all in yet another informative session of our weekly Wednesday seminar titled Good Fences Make Good Neighbours, looking at India with China in mind. China and India occupy a strategically significant position. As neighbors, their dynamic could significantly shape the geopolitics of the entire Asia Pacific region. According to the speaker of today's session, rather than relying on sentimental notions like the Hindi-Chini-Bhai-bhai camaraderie or an exaggerated belief in shared interests, a more practical and clear headed approach is preferable in engaging with China. With this, I would like to introduce the speaker for today's session, Professor Subrata K. Mitra, who is an emeritus professor of political science at Heidelberg University, Germany, and an adjunct professor at Dublin City University in Ireland. His research interests include Indian and comparative politics, rational choice, governance, citizenship, political theory, and foreign policy. His recent books include Governance by Stealth, The Ministry of Home Affairs and the Making of the Indian State, Politics in India, Structure, Process, Policy, Citizenship and the Flow of Ideas, The Puzzle of India's Governance, and India, Statecraft and Foreign Policy. Today's session will be chaired by Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, former Indian ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations, New York. He is a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation, New Delhi. He teaches diplomacy at the Diplo Foundation and writes and publishes regularly on international affairs in India and abroad. He has published several books, including Stamped in Memory, Dubai's Postal Service from 1909 to 1999, India and the United Nations, 1945 to 2015, A Photo Journey, Valor and Sacrifice, The First Indian Soldiers in Europe, 1914 to 1916, and Gallipoli Revisited, published in 2022. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow some housekeeping rules. All participants will be muted during the presentation. Questions can be posted in the chat box during the event, or you can raise your hand during the interactive session, and after the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask the questions. We request you to mention your name and affiliation while you raise your questions. That's all. I now hand over the floor to Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee to take the proceeding forward. Thank you, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kashish, for those words and for the introduction. I must say that I have been fortunate in interacting with Professor Mitra a little while before we started this meeting, and came to the understanding that he is the right person to illuminate the topic which we have chosen for discussion today. My own interaction and knowledge of China is very limited. I, in the course of my career, had interacted with them in 4 different areas. One is when I was in the World Trade Organization. China was trying to negotiate entry into the WTO. And what struck me at that time was that even without being inside the organization, they had deployed so many resources, professional negotiators as well as academics, to prepare themselves for entering into the organization. And I think that the outcome of that investment is very visible to many of us today when you see how China uses this multilateral organization for its own interests. The second area where I've interacted with China in slightly more depth is in the United Nations, environment negotiations, as well as sustainable development negotiations. In both India and China have been part of the same negotiating group. We call it the BASIC group of countries. It's an acronym, includes India and China. And both of us have leveraged the platform provided by the group of 77 developing countries to push for a mutually agreeable outcome most notably in Paris in the Climate Change Conference in 2015 and in the Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development, again in 2015. So those were my two negotiating experiences with China. And again, I was struck by the clear headed objectives which they had set and which they've used this group and their interaction with India to pursue. There's a niche in the United Nations where India and China work together, and most people don't know about it or speak about it, which is in deployment of troops for UN peacekeeping. In fact, over 1,000 Chinese infantry soldiers are serving under an Indian Army general in South Sudan as I speak. And that's part of a very successful holding operation. It's not a successful peacekeeping operation. It hasn't resolved the problem. But it has held the ground and provided protection to so many millions of civilians who are impacted by that crisis. So that's where we see our two countries and resources working together. The third area, and that is the only reason why I've visited China, is I used to deal with our interaction on countering terrorism. And after the Mumbai 2008 attacks, the India-China counterterrorism dialogue had just faded away. And I was asked in 2010 to try and revive it, and succeeded in doing that by meeting with China on the margins of a global counterterrorism forum negotiation. And we had two rounds of negotiations bilaterally between India and China, one in India and one in China. And here again, I think we cannot wish away the realities of Chinese involvement and interests in terrorist activities in the northeast of India, which was been going on for a long time. And then more recently, their alignment with Pakistan on Pakistan's own use of terrorism against India. This is a bread and butter issue for any state. It's a security issue. But I think that the track record of how we have dealt with each other in this area needs to be looked at more. And the last one on which I interacted with China was an Indian initiative. And that was Prime Minister Mr. Modi's proposal for an International Yoga Day to be declared by the United Nations. And I must say, and I've written about it, that the Chinese were the first major UN country to respond to this. They agreed with our proposal to co-sponsor it. And because of their co-sponsoring it with India, the proposal was implemented in 75 days with 177 co-sponsoring countries. So that's a fact. I mean, it's nothing that is secret, it's a fact, but I think it probably needs to be factored into discussions on India-China relations. And I'd like to end with these remarks. I was part of a think tank initiative just before the Galwan incidents in 2020. We brought out a book on behalf of the United Service Institution of India, which I am associated with, and the Sichuan University of China, on India and China building strategic trust. Unfortunately, the book was published in February 2020 and Galwan happened in May 2020. And I think the book just disappeared, and so did probably, and I hope the ideas didn't disappear. And I think, Professor Mitra, I would like to actually request you to begin your lecture and create a framework so that ideas which have come up on the table don't really always disappear. And with that, I'd like to welcome you to deliver your lecture. You have the floor, Professor.
Ambassador Mukherjee, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, sir, for these very kind words of introduction. I'll start by thanking Professor Alka Acharya and her colleagues for the invitation to give this talk, and particularly also to my friends from Colombia, China, and Ireland for joining us in this very convivial conversation. But most of all, I would like to thank Ambassador Kishan Rana for inducting me in his inevitable way to do something that I've never done before. I am specialized in India, and I talk mostly to people who work on India or who are comparing India, but not to a specialized group with experience in hands-on diplomacy, as well as deep knowledge of the data that this community has. And therefore, this invitation, it's an opportunity, but it has come as a great challenge. What I'm trying to do is to pack probably a bit too much in the 30 minutes allocated to me. That's why I've got a PowerPoint, which I'll certainly happily make available. It's already with the Institute of Chinese Studies, and anyone who wants to look at it is very welcome to do so, because I want this conversation to eventually feed into action, and that is possible by sharing the knowledge that, as we are doing today. What I'll do now is to go straight to the PowerPoint. I got the title, Good Fences Make Good Neighbors, from my colleagues in England. And when I arrived there, I was told, good fences make good neighbors. I was horrified. I said, no, I want to be friends with my neighbor. And this is when I was told, yeah, you talk like that because you're Indian, but that's not how it works. You stay on your side and she stays on her side. And if you are watchful, you can get on very nicely with one another. And so I thought that would be a good way of asking ourselves, how do we look at China and how can we be good neighbors? Let me see. How do I move the, Nicola, how do I move the, audience, please forgive me, I'm not terribly familiar with the moving. Okay. Do I just tap on this?
Up and down.
Okay.
And down.
Okay. All right. I'll start with the objectives of this lecture, then I'll explain why I, an India specialist, dare to talk about China. Where does China enter my academic journey? And then I'll talk a little about what kind of image we got of China, of India, looking at India through Chinese eyes. And that is when I'll go to Barrington Moore. And after that, I'll talk about the 4 faces of India that I have worked on through my long career: a modern state with Indian features, and an Indian specialty of producing order with the minimum use of force, and then how domestic politics cuts into the making of foreign policy, statecraft and foreign policy. And then I will talk about what is essential about Indians' modernity. How does India look deeply into her classical past in order to join the 21st century? I will then look at the audience and ask them to join me to do it the other way around. What does India look like from the Chinese side? And what do China specialists think of China when they have looked at what India looks like from the Chinese side? This will prepare us to go into the next stage of the talk, which is the policy. How do we engage? How does India engage with China in a manner which will do good to both sides, a kind of win-win outcome? And then I'll ask, is this simply wistful thinking on my part? As a political scientist, I'm not allowed to dream, not when they're working. Or is there any empirical evidence of the feasibility of dialogues between adversaries? So a little bit about the objective of this lecture. I started by saying that this opportunity is also a challenge, because how does one talk meaningfully? I mean, imagine you are talking to someone who only knows Swahili. You can only do some hand gestures. You can't really get yourself across because there are no shared vocabulary. When political scientists talk about 2 quantities, they have to ask themselves, how does the self explain itself to the other? What is that conceptual bridge? And the reason I'm talking about it is because when you talk about India among political scientists, there are certain parameters which are in common. And when you talk about India, Indian politics, Indian development, or Indian constitution, there are some basic parameters like the social contract between those who have power and those who are affected by that power, individualism, and the concept of rule of law. All these things are sort of drilled into our head with years and years of, as political scientists in India, of Hobbes, Locke, Mill, Bentham, and that lot. So constantly you're talking about India in terms of parameters that you share with your epistemic community. When it comes to China, I ask myself, how can I go about it? Because when you talk about India and China, you're told like two boxes, they have two labels on them. One is a democracy, the other is a totalitarian state. So how can they talk to one another? Because there is no conceptual bridge in terms of basic parameters of discourse. So the best you can do is either to talk past one another or to fight, which is not really to talk, but to substitute the other with the self. Meaningful conversations, therefore, would be the first major challenge that we have. How can India and China construct one another meaningfully in order to make conversation possible? The second objective is then to ask, and this community has already been engaged with this theme, how does one connect with China? How does one engage with China? Should it be the iron fist or should it be open arms, the bhai-bhai? Should one aggress? Should one capitulate? Should one assert? These are the issues that have emerged from within this community. And my hope is by understanding India the way I'm planning to, one would come to a situation where India and China can look at each other in the eye and have a meaningful conversation. Let me now go to the next stage, which is why, how do I get into China? How does my growing up in India has brought something like China to my thought process? The first point here goes back all the way to 1962, the India-China War. I'm in high school, an active member of the National Cadet Corps, and I'm in a small town in northern Odisha where nothing ever happened. But we are allocated night patrol duty, so put on uniform and go around the town to see that lights are off because there has to be blackout. And with that, there is some of my generation might remember a film called Hakikat with Balraj Shani fighting Chinese, and the slogans, Nepal Ladakh Bharat ka, nahi Chin ka baap ka. So you get into your head a kind of image of China as an aggressor. With that image comes in 1971 a shock. I'm in Delhi studying political science and I've opted for the China paper, and I encounter the rest of the course was pretty conventional, but the Chinese part had ace scholars. There was Mira Sinha, K.P. Gupta, and Gargi and V.P. Dutt, and most of all, Manoranjan Mahanti. He's also from Odisha, so we would call him Manoranjan Bhai. I could experience there in the community of Chinese professors or Indians who taught Chinese politics, two things which was like a fresh air. The first was the moral appeal of Mao's thought. Imagine, I'm 18-year-old and suddenly I see a kind of politics which lifts the downtrodden into power and gives him dignity. So the moral appeal of Chinese politics, of Mao's thought. The second thing that came across, and Manoranjan Mahanti was primarily responsible for it, he had just come from Berkeley, was the concept of political analysis. Political analysis, which would talk about the world in terms of variables and will show recurrent patterns of behavior. I put the two things together, and that result my itinerary. Instead of sitting for competitive exams, which is what people do when they switch to political science, I decided my path was going to be elsewhere. The Chinese politics polarized our group. Some went into political action. I'll not talk about them. And in my case, contemplation became my method of action. I decided I will study India with the same rigor with which my professors of Chinese politics have studied China. And then I go to higher studies in the University of Rochester and take with me the image of India that I got from my Chinese professors. And that was spelled out in the book of Barrington Moore, who compares three paths to modernity. That will be the next slide: the capitalist path, the fascist path, and the socialist path. And Moore had shown that India didn't belong to any one of those, that India was bound to stay democratic but paralyzed. So peaceful paralysis is what Moore had talked about. But in Rochester in graduate school, when I start analyzing India in terms of three paradigms I was introduced to, I started seeing a different image of India. That was systems analysis, rational choice, and structural functionalism. Rational choice appealed to me very much. It simply says most people know what they want and what they don't want and what they will settle down for, their plan B, and they will use what resources they have to push politics in their direction. And democracy in India was giving that nuclear weapon to humble hands. And that was changing the face of India. So the Moore idea, much as it appealed to me, remained stuck in my head as to why was the prediction of Moore not quite coming through, that instead of stagnating, India was beginning to make rapid strides. Until I went to China in 2011 and had a chance to lecture on India at the Tsinghua University, and also had interviews with the foreign ministry, but most of all spent a day in a Chinese village. I have done a lot of village studies in Odisha and Gujarat, so I could connect to the village and I could see the system from below. And that again changed my image of China. And today, as I talk to you all, looking at India with China in mind and reciprocally, I have got my fifth introduction to the India-China comparison. So to Barrington Moore. Capitalist path, like in England, is the marriage of new money in towns and old money and power in villages. That creates the capitalist path. Fascist path, as Moore says, Barrington Moore, the marriage of iron and rye. He has Germany as an example. The strong Junkers and a weak bourgeoisie produce fascism. And socialism happens when workers and peasants join, they take power and use the power to improve their lot. And Moore says none of it will happen in India because India doesn't have that kind of capitalism which will bring democratic change. And fascism is also not possible because the Indian Zamindar is not the equivalent of the German Junker. And there is no chance of socialism because you don't have that kind of political party which would mobilize. Mind you, this is early 60s when Moore is talking about these things. And he says you have to extract and invest in order to produce modernity. But how can you extract when you are a democracy? He says it is like asking Turkeys to vote for Christmas. It will not happen. You need a forceful regime, and that India doesn't have. So India would be condemned to peaceful paralysis. I said to myself, peaceful paralysis, but we don't see peaceful paralysis. We see a state which holds together and which is making in its own way progress. Like there was 0% growth under 150 years of colonial rule in India. India in the 50s was already laying down infrastructure and growing. In the Green Revolution in the 60s had wiped out famine of that kind. And then I said to myself, no, we have got to look at India in terms of the political analysis that I've learned, the method, and that's how I came up with the 4 phases of India that I'm talking about here. It is a modern state with quintessentially Indian features. This state has discovered how to maximize order with a minimum of force, and this state has learned how to make a foreign policy which should be saleable at home and acceptable abroad. And its modernity is not borrowed Western modernity, but its modernity has links to its classical roots. So these are the 4 topics on which I've written books, and this is what I'll focus on. It is going to be, for those who are not familiar, it's going to be a little complicated, but I would be happy to answer questions, because if I start getting into details, I'll run out of time. So in this image, I'm trying to show how India goes from the independent, the post-colonial state. How does the post-colonial state go from tradition to modernity? Here, I'm taking issue with a well-known political scientist called Huntington. Huntington, in his book, Political Order in Changing Societies, came up with a law-like generalization. His generalization was, post-colonial democracies will fail. Why? Because post-colonial democracies bring in mobilization of the people, and mobilization creates ethnic mobilization. Ethnic groups want their own states. It creates ambitions on the part of the poor and deprived, so their expectations keep going up. And the majority itself, the ethnic majority, wants to remake the state in its own image. So these are the kind of 3 things which will kill a post-colonial democracy. Expectations will go above capacities, and the gap will produce disorder. This did not happen in India. India remains the exception among post-colonial democracies to have sustained democracy, and I'm asking, why is this the case? And this is where I said, if between state and society, there is an elite with a very special character, that might make a change. What kind of elite? An elite which has come up from the bottom of the pyramid to the top through democracy, because democracy is like a lift. It takes social elites from the lower levels up and makes them political elites, and the same lift coming down brings down people who are born to rule. The notables and the rajas, the Brahmins, the people who are born to power gradually are weeded out. So this elite knows what it was like below. And this elite, if they make policies which manage order, which bring reform, social, economic, and political, and which have a method of constitutionally incorporating core social values, and a judicialization which constantly keeps society and state in sync in terms of basic values. If this package is made available in terms of policy, then a post-colonial state would not go kaput, but will slowly change its internal architecture and will continue to be resilient and stay together. This is my take in my book on politics in India, and this is why I'm saying this state is modern, but has some quintessentially Indian characteristics, particularly the kind of elites we have. These are elites who are power hungry, who are a little promiscuous, politically speaking, or to use a technical term, they're fungible. Like, look at how the coalitions that we have in India bring together opposites. They are galvanized by power. But at the same time, this is an elite which has not forgotten where it comes from. It has not forgotten the people out there. So they respond to the political market with a package of policies that has a bit of identity, bit of order, and a lot of social welfare. And this is what makes India continue to be democratic and resilient. In order to stay legitimate, the Constitution has built in a method where different groups with different identities still have an interface. That interface is the Constitution, that's the core systemic values, and it has built into it an arbitrator in the form of the Supreme Court and regulatory mechanisms that constantly interpret the constitutional norm in terms of social practices. It's this mechanism at the heart of the state which makes it possible, in the case of conflict, for groups to negotiate with one another. And the whole idea is part of life will be left to the private sphere, that the state will not regulate every aspect of life, but regulate only those aspects where the self meets the other, so that the social sphere would be regulated, private sphere will remain private, and the Constitution would be above all and interpreted by the Supreme Court. For this, there is a process, and that is again an Indian speciality. I call it transactional radicalism. And believe it or not, the whole idea comes from Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi is, of course, a British-trained barrister, and this barrister knows how to negotiate. But this barrister, when he's told, Mr. Gandhi, it's no longer negotiable, he says, okay, I'll go back and talk to my people, and he would start a satyagraha. So Gandhi discovers this method of institutional participation and rational protest. Combining both, the British understand that here is someone we can talk to, but he wants more and more, and at some point we have to give more in order to stay legitimate. And that has deeply influenced India's political culture and process, as you can see, between the ruling elites, counter elites, and radical actors, and responsible governance in India. There are various linkages. There are the regulatory agencies. The Supreme Court every day comes up with the ruling of one kind or another. And then there is the army and police to hold the margins of order. But beyond that, there are periodic elections and legal and normative changes, and occasionally riots or movements. But the riots and movements have also become a method of creating new elites. You start a movement, and eventually the movement becomes the AAP government. Now, these new elites and stakeholders are specialists in power sharing. If you have followed what happened in Uttarkashi, you would see how the state governments and the central government and all kinds of agencies shared the responsibility of getting those 41 people out. So that for me was a microcosmic way of understanding the internal process of the Indian state. We move over to the second one now, governance by stealth. What you have here is a photo of the North Block. I have this photo here because for me, this is symbolic of a great transition. Think of British colonial rule. The Home Department has a job, which is to keep Indian nationalism at bay. And come independence, the Home Department becomes the Home Ministry, and the department whose job it was to stop nationalism, it then becomes crucial to nation building. So poachers become gamekeepers. How did this transition take place? And what were the 50s like? How did India generate a method of keeping the country orderly with the number of policemen per million among the lowest in the world? What has kept India that kind of orderly? For that, this book on governance by stealth taught me a lot. I spent a whole semester in the National Archives, and I could look at 209 declassified secret files of the ministry. and Home Ministry. And this is where I learned how policies leading to order are made. When you see a law, you only see the sort of visible part of an iceberg. The law that you see started way below in the form of a proposal from the lowest level of the ministry, and it slowly comes up, and there is a lot of debate within the ministry of how to go ahead with a law which would be both constitutional but politically feasible. And this is what the ministry does. This is what the Home Secretary does as a go-between between the bureaucracy on the one side and political party on the other side. It's a great Indian peculiarity where the Home Secretary is a civil servant who will serve any master, and political power in the hands of the Home Minister and the Prime Minister keep changing depending on the election. But one does not change the Home Secretary just because the government has changed. So there is terrific continuity, and it's this internal knowledge that I got from the ministry showed me how the governance in India constantly keeps pace with society. This also showed me things that I did not know about, which is the terrific presence of paramilitary forces and how civil and military forces in India join hands to keep order within the country, as well as how they look at external enemies and act together to keep India safe. Again, an Indian peculiarity, the paramilitary forces are under the control of the Home Ministry. Why is that? Because Home is civilian, Home connects directly to all parts of India, including parts which are ruled by opposition parties, and they are able to mobilize paramilitary forces to tackle violence within the country, because the army is reticent to fight Indians. The army's job is to fight India's enemies, except in exceptional circumstances. But this flexibility and malleability is very, very important to order making. In one of my interviews, I asked, what does the Home Ministry do when there is a outbreak of violence, for example, in the district of Dhenkanal, which I come from? Do you wait for the Chief Minister to tell you what to do? And the person smiled, a former Home Secretary. He said, the Superintendent of Police and the District Magistrate are both our men or our people, because now there are women too. And we get alerted immediately and we come up with a solution, and usually Chief Ministers accept our solution. So you see, underneath the cover of democracy, there is another mechanism which goes on and keeps India orderly. That is governance by stealth. Now come to foreign policy. When there is a challenge to a country's sovereignty, the country has to decide, should it aggress, should it capitulate, or should it assert its legitimate interests? This is something I got from Robert Putnam's two-level game, which is where the decision maker asks itself, what is sellable, what is acceptable internally? Who are the national interlocutors, and what is acceptable externally? By the way, this has now come out as a book on the open access, Statecraft and Foreign Policy. You can download it if you wish. And the decision makers themselves have their own internal values, internal interests, and personalities. Someone like Indira Gandhi would be much more risk-taking than someone like, let's say, Manmohan Singh. Or Nehru would be normally risk-averse, but when irritated, he can also become very risk-taking, like in 62. So this is the kind of compromise Ambassador Mukherjee will probably know a lot more about it because he's a diplomat and he has known action from close by. I'm an amateur. I'm assuming that when there's a crisis, these decision makers get all these interlocutors together within the cabinet and they decide which course of action to follow. This is something we'll talk about probably now. For example, India has been able to keep her strategic autonomy in very, very difficult circumstances like Ukraine, like Palestine. But this is happening because of this mechanism called statecraft and foreign policy. My final point here on the fourth phase of India, probably the most important phase, which is how does India's state connect to India's classical roots? I've done a book with one of my students on Kautilya's Arthashastra and have learned a lot from it. Look, long before Hobbes and Machiavelli, here is someone who is saying 400 years before the birth of Christ, Raja, king, don't forget you are there not for your private pleasure, but for the praja. And the Brahmins will watch you so that you can be a good king and you'll be trained for it. Why should the king bow to the Brahmin? Because both the Brahmin and the king are tied together by dharma, by the transcendental character of righteousness. But the king is also there not only for transcendental purposes, but transactional purposes too, to keep order internally with a ring of espionage and externally by having alliances. 400 years before the birth of Christ, one has this brilliant theory called mandala, which says your neighbor will always have an issue with you. River waters, smuggling, or expanding your boundaries, there will be, like in a couple, always little nitpicking issues. But the neighbor's neighbor may become your friend. So this mandala theory shows how to work out alliances. Now, these are then the two facets of India's classical roots, the dharmic phase and the secular phase of power. And the Indian state now has acquired the capacity to combine both the dharmic roots. Dharma is in Sanskrit, dharayati iti dharma, that which holds together, that which holds this very complex society together. And at the same time, not to forget that power is about getting people to do what you want them to do and to stop them from doing what they would like to do. This is then, for me, the essence of India's modernity, which is modern, like modern technology. Indians are very good at it. There was a time when the joke was, more Indians have access to smartphones than toilets. That's no longer true. But India is a modern state. Indian market is thriving, but internally, it is also connected to its past. It's not a borrowed modernity. I'll now abruptly switch to China. Let's think of China in terms of the four features I've seen in India. A modern state with Confucian roots. Why does this communist state set up Confucius centers all over the world, including one in Heidelberg? And what does one get from the Confucian values? I'm in Tsinghua University, and my student takes me to the Mensa, to the student cafeteria. It's full. She stands in front of a table and says, I have brought a distinguished Indian visitor. Will two people give up their seats? To my amazement, two students stood up and just left. They bowed and left, and we sat at their place. This kind of respect for knowledge amazed me, and I find that Confucian. And I've seen in China that importance of Chinese culture, but it's a very modern state anyway, and their highways will beat anybody else's. foreign policy with domestic constraints. What was the domestic constraint in 1962 in China? There's a lot of work on it now, which was pushing Mao's China to attack India. And what is it today? Chinese nationalism, which is influencing China's policy towards Taiwan. So that the same Indian nationalism influencing Indian foreign policy, Chinese nationalism influencing Chinese foreign policy. My third point is, it's a totalitarian state, I'm told, and the Communist Party decides everything. When I went to the Chinese village, I'll talk about it next, I didn't see the party all over the place. I could feel its presence, but it was ruling, it was governing by stealth. The hammer was there, certainly, but people didn't have to be hammered over the head for them to do what the state wanted them to do. And socialism with Chinese features. I've read a brilliant essay in the homepage of the Institute of Chinese Studies from Professor Hemant Adlaka, and I was asking myself, does the Chinese ideology, socialist, all right, and it talks about food, talks about the basic minimum needs, but there is something Chinese about it. If you like Chinese films, I would strongly encourage you to see a film by Zhang Yimou called Life, or Leben in German, and in the last scene, it's based on Chinese Revolution, what you would see is people eating. So in China, I've been told categorically, legitimacy comes through your mouth. You get legitimacy because you give people roti, kapda, or makan, food, clothing, and shelter, and dignity. Am I talking about India or am I talking about China? So when I go back, if I go back to the beginning of this lecture, when I said China and India are presented to us as two boxes with labels, democracy and totalitarianism. But when you look at the contents of those boxes, you probably find a lot more similarity than dissimilarity. Now to the Chinese village. It's called Back to Room Village, 2 hours from by car, by superhighways from Beijing. I go to this village and I'm told the village has a mosque. It had at the time about 2,000 people. And I said, a mosque? In communist China, I want to see the mosque. So I'm taken to see the mosque. And I said, well, it doesn't quite look like a mosque, does it? Because mosque for me have Arabian features. Then I'm told, no. Look at the top. It has Islamic features, but it's a Chinese mosque. And so I go into the mosque and speak to the Imam. I said, say, Imam, do people go from here to do Hajj? So Imam says, you are an Indian, how do you know about Hajj? I said, Imam, there are more Muslims in India than in Pakistan. And so, do people go for Hajj? Yes, people go for Hajj. I said, and who select those people? He said, we give a list, but the party selects. As well, in India also people go to Hajj, but the Home Ministry has its own method of deciding who are the people going. And many other things, we talk about Islam and so on. Of course, leaving, I said to the Imam, well, Imam, I must be the first Indian to visit your mosque. He said, yes, you are. But the Pakistanis were here last week. So the Imam certainly was well connected to China's foreign relations, and he knew a thing or two about China and its neighboring states. And I was amazed to get in the village a touch of their strategic pragmatism. In course of my walkabout in the village, I needed to use a toilet, but they didn't have a toilet, so I had to go to somebody's home. 6 months later, my student writes to me, the village committee, now I met the village committee in the evening in the Moon Festival party. There was a huge man who was a village leader, not a member of the party. As a young man, he had gone to Beijing, made a lot of money, but wanted to come back to the village and do things for his village. So they made him the village leader. In the party was also the Imam and the party secretary who had to live in the middle for a party meeting, but I noticed people are not really taking him seriously. I have left. What the village leader does is to persuade the party secretary to write an application to Beijing, saying, distinguished visitors are coming to the village, but we don't have a toilet, so please give us some land so that we can build a toilet. And my students sent me a picture of this toilet. It looks like a toilet. It doesn't have the name Professor Mitra's toilet, but it was for me an example of how the village was able to mobilize an opportunity to do something for itself. And this, for me, describes Chinese society. They're strategic, they're pragmatic, they're law-abiding, and they know which side of the bread is buttered, and they will go for it. What is India doing about it? Now, I've deliberately put this picture because this is early Modi, and this is the Modi who has said, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabse Vishwas, friendship with all, alliance with none. And this picture of Modi, Putin, and Xi Jinping is something that my colleagues in the West will not be able to deconstruct, but I am able to deconstruct it because these three people are running their states pretty much on the four axes that I have defined here. So, ladies and gentlemen, what should India do with regard to China? The first thing to do is to convey the concept of India's strategic autonomy meaningfully to China. Why is that? Because, as I said before, many Chinese think India has gone over to the dark side. They can't be partners anymore. Just like the Americans think Indians are our partners, but if we go to war on Taiwan, India will remain neutral. What India is trying to do, and Mr. Jaishankar has said it very eloquently, is to look after Indians and look after India's interests without breaking global norms. Since India has not made a sanction against Russia, India can buy oil from Russia. India, similarly, is allied with Israel, but India has not gone away from the two-state solution, which India has been a votary of. Or in other words, India is doing what is good for Indians, what India's political community would want, and what is acceptable globally without breaking global norms. Then, Kautilyan realism, which combines dharma and mandala, is what India's value structure is about. So why should Indians get worked up if the Economist downgrades India in terms of a liberal democracy? Elections are going on. I have been covering elections. The elections are about roti kapda makan, about subsidies. I haven't seen a lot of electoral speeches on keeping India liberal and democratic. In other words, Indian politics is about enfranchisement, empowerment, and entitlement. And India's democracy has 750 million stakeholders. Who will take it away from them? It's like putting the toothpaste back in the tube. So I don't get worked up when India's democracy gets downgraded by Western ranking agencies. Strength with flexibility is what one needs, and we have to remember mandala. We have to remember that like Rajput Rifles Regiment has a motto, Veera Bhagya Vasundhara, the earth becomes those who have the power. So mobilization across the icy Himalayas seems economically probably not the best thing to do, but it is necessary. It is necessary but not sufficient. Have the army, but explain in so many words what is India doing in terms of strategic autonomy. I then step back a little to the composite dialogue that one doesn't talk about anymore. I thought it was a good idea to negotiate each point that affects India-China relations separately. Now, the border is one thing, and buying computer hardware is another thing. I think we should be able, again, here I look towards Ambassador Mukherjee and Kishanji, Ambassador Rana, and others who know about diplomacy. I don't. I only study it as an academic. But the composite dialogue is probably a good idea, and one has to think about it. And then I have something to really get on the nerves of the Chinese, which is to suggest a two-step solution to solve the Taiwan imbroglio. They're saying that, look, you guys want a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, so why not try it out at home, at least as an issue of negotiation? And the China specialists in this community will surely find this idea outrageous, but that is the reason I'm talking about it. Now, I'm talking as if a negotiation between conflicting partners is possible. Now, is this, once again, a romantic idea, or are there historical examples where such things have happened? I go back to the game theorist Axelrod and his work on trench warfare in the First World War. Imagine 500 miles. On the one side are the Germans, on the other side are the Anglo-French army, and they're in the trenches. Now, entrenchment is like stationary warfare. You stay in the trench, fire a little, and go back to the trench. And you have seen pictures of what is happening in Ukraine now, and living in trenches is a miserable life. So you are entrenched, and the other side is entrenched. This is where Axelrod shows that four things happen. First, across 100 meters, you can see your adversary. You are 18, you are a German boy, or you are a French boy, or an English boy. You have left behind your sweetheart or your mother, and you see the enemy. And you have the knowledge, that's the second point. You have the knowledge that he is suffering and you are also suffering. And then you know that you are in the trench today, you will be there tomorrow, you will be there the day after unless you are killed. So it's not something you can pack and go away. Then you discover that if you are nice to him, he will be nice to you. That there is such a thing called tit for tat. And from this, these entrenched soldiers discover a signaling system, firing to say, we are now going to have a truce or fire pausa of, let's say, 2 hours. You can come out, go to the loo or whatever. And then after 2 hours, another signal, we are now going to shoot for real. And this is how the entrenched soldiers developed a signal which made it possible for them to have a Christmas truce or sometimes even play football. So historically, this has been possible. Of course, the headquarters in Berlin and London discovered what was going on, and they found a technique to break it up. They found a technique to break it up by ordering the entrenched soldiers not to fire along the border, across the border, to fire elsewhere, to have surprise raids. So you are here, and tomorrow you'll be attacking someone far away, to the left or to the right. Or in other words, your enemy will not know you, there will be no proximity, no knowledge, and there will be no chance of reciprocity. So you will no longer follow that signaling system, you will shoot for real. So here then the question is, how does one bring this to our debate? To this, I'm talking about a meaningful negotiation, which will be possible if there is reciprocal empathy. That you don't just look at the box and say democracy or dictatorship, you look into the box. You look at the villagers in that back two-room village, and you understand how they feel about hunger, about crops going bad, or about pandemic. And they feel that you are not cardboard cartoons, you are real human beings suffering. And if there is this mutual empathy, and to use a technical term I have just learned, if you combine a realist ontology and constructivist epistemology, realist ontology means bullets will kill. Constructivism is to construct your opponent, construct the other. Will he shoot? Will he not shoot? If you could combine the two so that you have a common minimum conceptual tool for a discourse, for a meaningful conversation, but you also have the empathy to know what goes into that language. If you could combine the two, and once again, I look at Ambassador Mukherjee, who has been part of very complicated negotiations in the WTO, and I'm asking, when is a negotiation successful? My hypothesis as an amateur academic is that it works only when both sides are able to define common minimum parameters. A thing is a thing, like Ludwig Wittgenstein said in the early work, a cat is on the mat. A cat is in the mat. Everyone knows what is a cat. Everyone knows what is a mat. And this statement, the cat is on the mat, is meaningful to both sides. But what does this image evoke in you? Does this image evoke a happy home life or a desire that I don't have it, I would like to have it? So both sides can talk if they agree on the terms of conversation, but also have an idea about what is the intention behind at the back of his head. Only then, I would argue, a meaningful conversation between adversaries, in this case between India and China, would be possible. And Indians have also something else to do. I got this picture from The Economist in 2017. The Economist magazine from London has always been a bit contemptuous towards India. So in this picture, they are saying, India, jumping like a tiger, but it is a paper tiger. As you can see, the paper is peeling off, and this man who is riding a tiger will not dare get off that tiger, because if he does, the tiger will eat him. So in a manner of speaking, the Economist pretty much dismissed India, saying, well, they will be peacefully paralyzed. I think this is a false image of India today. And if you have followed, like I have followed, hour by hour, pulling out 41 people from that collapsed tunnel, big machineries are needed, but also ultimately the miners with their very primitive digging tools. India knew how to combine the two, and they cooperated, all the agencies, and they got them out. That is the image of India that I would like you to remember when you talk about India meaningfully to Indians and to the adversaries. Thank you very much for the opportunity to engage you all in this conversation.
Thank you, Professor Mitra. You have really taken us through a very, very broad canvas, including your own journey, intellectual journey, your knowledge of China. And I noticed that you asked three questions to Ambassador Rana and to myself. One is about strategic autonomy. The other is about whether or not one should have a composite dialogue. And third is when are negotiations considered successful? So these are three questions which, of course, are eternal questions. But I would just like to, before I give the floor to Ambassador Rana, who's asked for it, I just like to give you a very brief response to these 3 points. Composite on strategic autonomy, I think that one framework which people would need to keep in mind is what is the strategic framework in which India is expected to make these choices of strategic autonomy. And I believe that we are living through a transition period in which we are adding a completely new framework to our traditional strategic space, which is the maritime domain. And how this will impact on thinking in Delhi, which is so far away from the maritime boundaries of India, is something that is work in progress. I believe that we are slowly repositioning ourselves in the space between the Mediterranean and the Pacific. That is a strategic space that I think we need to give more attention to, but on our own terms. And I'm glad you mentioned how we need to look at it in terms of our own interests. The second point about composite dialogue, I'm not a specialist on India-China dialogue mechanisms, but I think that just on two areas, and I keep reading about it all the time and sometimes dealing with it, is on trade and on technology. India and China are engaged. I mean, there is no disconnect there. And I think you just need to see the business newspapers, the business magazines to understand how deep and deeper this is becoming. So the politics probably will have to catch up or adjust to the realities of economics and technology. And on the third point of when will negotiations be successful, I think the classic answer is when there is peace and predictable security. Now, when will we quantify peace and predictable security in the absence of a treaty, in the absence of I mean, what in Europe they tried to achieve in 1975 with the Helsinki Final Act, but then that European sort of example seems to have collapsed with the Ukraine war. So are we going to reinvent for Asia and for a multipolar Asia a construct of indivisible peace and security? This is a challenge which is before us and the generations that are coming after us in the diplomatic area. So with these three brief comments, Ambassador Rana, please, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Ashok. I think you've more or less anticipated what one could put to Professor Subrata Mitra. We are in a state of complex engagement. There are elements of adversity and there are elements of working together. And you gave some outstanding examples of this yourself, Ashok, in what you said. Our challenge, really, at the end of the day, is a domestic challenge. How do we build up an India that will be commensurate with our ambitions, with our dreams, and with our expectations? And the situation in which we find ourselves with China should be handled, as you said, on the border. Strength is necessary, but not sufficient. And that's exactly the point. Very persuasively presented, which is that it is really our own domestic capacity, our capability, which will determine India's future. And that is where we have a government that has moved within parameters of the possible. There is no point in saying that India should do this and should do that. There is also the political realm within which any government functions. And I think they are pretty good judges of what is doable and what is, for now, not so doable. So I think we are on a track which is the correct one. And it's not a track that can always be explained to people, because there are things that happen behind the scenes which are not in the public domain. And then people jump up and down and say, oh, but why aren't we doing this and why aren't we doing that, without knowing what is actually going on. So I would say, really, we have a situation where effective management of the economy, of the political system is under implementation in my eyes. We may criticize one or another aspect of it, but in the main, on track, and we have a gentle process of engagement that is perhaps underway vis-a-vis China, but also underway with other global partners, because India has to work with the broad global community. India has to be a firm believer in the plurality of power. I don't pose this as a question, but really, I want to thank Professor Mitra for presenting to us on a very, very broad canvas the way in which a modern political scientist, who is not a specialist on China, looks at the situation in which India and China today work together. These are some thoughts and reflections, but they don't really make up for any sharp, pointed questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Professor.
May I respond to the two comments that have been made?
Yes.
First of all, Ambassador Mukherjee, thank you for talking about the framework within which a negotiation takes place. I had not thought about it. That the framework itself is important, and one can't just rush into a negotiation without thinking about the framework itself. So the framework itself presupposes peace, guaranteed security, and I'll have to factor that in when I think about it further. Over to Ambassador Rana. Sir, when you gently persuaded me to meet the community, I thought to myself, how can I talk meaningfully if we don't have a minimum common parameter of discourse? And that is when I came up with the idea of these boxes, because in Germany, when you talk about India and China, you're only told about those two boxes: democracy and dictatorship, and then a flawed democracy at that. And that is when, sir, I'm grateful to you for forcing me to think through the argument and open those boxes. And that is where I found more similarity than dissimilarity. There are major dissimilarities, but there's a lot more similarity than one thinks. And the time I spent in the Chinese village was very, very important for me, because I learned something which I have not seen in my Indian villages. I've seen more of it in Gujarat than in Odisha. This kind of strategic pragmatism and of taking an opportunity. Having said that, it's not that Indians are not able to vote with their feet. Just look at the breakdown of people among those 41 trapped people in the tunnel. There are no jobs in Odisha. Well, you go to Uttarkashi. And this is exactly what is happening in China. There's like 100 million floating population, and they are the ones, sort of the slave laborers of the winning Chinese economy, who are making these breakthroughs and dumping their products on others. So there are similarities, but I would like our local politics also to take a lot more autonomy. The village leadership in Back-to-Room village knew how to use an opportunity, and that is something that I don't find. I will be slightly technical here. One of our domestic problems is democracy somehow getting trapped at the middle level. It's a kind of a middle democracy trap. The first level is the knowledge of roti, kapra, or makan, food, clothing, shelter, which can come through enfranchisement, empowerment, and entitlement. And elections are about revelry, about giveaways. This is, again, part of the logic of electoral democracy. And you have seen how even the Modi government has moved more and more towards welfareism. This is necessary but not sufficient, because democracy can handle politics within the system, but not politics of the system. Politics within the system is transactional. What can I get out of the state? But what is the state about? What are the core values of the state? What are the core areas of the economy that need to be reformed, need to be restructured? That is the level where you can't solve democratically, and there you have to go into reform by stealth, like governance by stealth. I follow the writings of Ashok Gulati on the Indian agriculture, and he's showing how the subsidies are killing Indian agriculture or stymie. In Heidelberg, in the local market, I find products like courgette, like aubergine from small African, Latin American countries. I never ever see any Indian agricultural product in the normal German market. Of course, if you go to specialized markets, you might find a few. But where the large market is concerned, why are these small countries able to export? Because they have taken to global value chains in agriculture. So there are areas, Ambassador Rana is absolutely right, our major constraint is domestic. And I would like a lot more knowledge of Kautilyan realism, of Chinese pragmatism, and strategic opportunity structure. Our politicians are very good at fungibility, but they are not very good at teaching what one can do at one's own level. Anyway, we can talk more and more about it, but I've learned things from China that I would like to see at home. I certainly don't want to see in my village market Chinese ball pens, Chinese shoes, Chinese umbrellas, okay, but please, not China-made Ganesh statues. They are able to sell them all the way in my village. So in the old days, they used to say, computer chips okay, but not potato chips. There was something about it. We need a lot to do at home, domestically. I completely agree with you.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to now ask participants in this discussion group if you have any questions or any points, any observations you'd like to make, even on the topic itself, which is a provocative topic. So is there anything that you'd like? Just jump in, unmute yourself and jump in, or let just put your hand up if you can. It'll be a pleasure to listen to you and to have Professor Mitra respond to what you have to say. So is there anyone from this group of 20 who are logged in? There must be some of you with some point to make. Well, from the ICS itself, anyone? Yes, Mr. Yes, I have one hand. Ting Wang, if I pronounced your name right. You have the floor. Please just give your background and ask or make your point. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Professor Mitra. Thank you for your wonderful sharing. Yeah, I just have a very short question about the transformation of modern society. Yeah, I like your point, the traditional rules, the classic rules in modern society in India. And similarity, China has a long history and Chinese culture. So I just want to ask you, how do you think that there are also different classification of modern society, like Indian modern society, Chinese modern society, Romanian, Russian, rather than American or German modern society? For example, Chinese society cannot be turned into a modern society like American or German at all. So I just want to ask, how do you think the definition of the word modern maybe is different in different social contexts? Thank you.
May I respond, sir?
Yes, Professor.
Thank you very much for this wonderful question. First of all, why is this question there? Because if you're not an India specialist, you're looking at India from outside, you would be thinking, oh my God, there are elections and all they talk about is the caste. So they have remained where they always were. And this is a caste society. Now, that is how India will probably come across. And that is why one would ask, how can Indian society modernize? First of all, I would have to tell you that the caste that you see is not the caste you think about. The caste you are thinking about is Homo hierarchicus, like in the old Indological sociologists, of being told you are this and you can't be anything else. The caste you see is caste consciousness, is using the negotiable power of pooled votes by members of a particular group. Or in other words, caste is a social network, and social networks are mobilized on ethnic lines, on language lines, on religious lines at the time of elections. So there's a caste is therefore to be deconstructed. Once you deconstruct caste, you would find within Indian society a lot more consciousness now of what one is entitled to, who one is. And this is being sort of accelerated through a number of mechanisms. One of them, of course, is the Indian system of reservations, which is to say, a quota system of giving special privileges to members of those parts of society that have been traditionally deprived, like the former untouchables. I always say former because to call someone an untouchable is itself a criminal offense. And this is how the state has mobilized itself to empower those who are disempowered. Now, of course, it creates a lot of competition. Each group wants a little more, and that then produces its own dynamic. The second thing I would like to show you is what is in common between the modern German, modern American, or for that matter, modern Indian. The common thing is the consciousness of identity. In India now, who I am and what I'm entitled to has become, from my observations and my research, a common currency of politics. And the state is constantly accelerating it, which probably is why you'll be surprised to know that the President of India is not just a woman, she is a member of a tribal community, communities which lived in deep forests in the long past and who have remained more or less isolated. And the Prime Minister himself comes from the backward classes. So you find the lower orders of society slowly going up. There's the logic of numbers. The sort of highly privileged Brahmins, for example, were a small minority. And in democracy, the logic of numbers pushes the more numerous groups towards center of power. So you have a number of churning going on, social churning, and Indian society is modernizing in that sense. What, however, remains still to be researched further are some symbols that might make India look like a traditional society, which is the preponderance of religious symbols or the dominance of the cow in the public sphere. Now, these, if you have been following the rescue of the 41 miners trapped in a collapsed tunnel, you would have seen that at the mouth of the tunnel was a little shrine temporarily put there to worship the shrine goddess, the tunnel goddess to help rescue these trapped miners. Similarly, there is a talk of lynching on the basis of this cow slaughter. The question is, why do these traditional symbols still take such a place of pride in the public sphere? What are they evocative of? In other words, Indian modernity itself has contestable areas, and there's a lot of debate within India as to what we should do with these godmen, or how can you tell a charlatan, or what can one do to regulate, according to the constitution, business, including business in selling of meat. So it's not that the issues I'm talking about are going unattended to. Or in other words, India is modernizing in her own way. This modernity has deep links to the classical origins, and there are institutional mechanisms to draw the distinction between legal and the illegal. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Any follow-up questions, Ms. Bang? Anything else that? Yes, Nicholas, you have raised your hand. You have the floor. Please unmute. Yes.
Many thanks, Ambassador. Many thanks to all of us, all of you, sorry, and Professor Mitra for his wonderful presentation. It is a little bit new for me because I come from Colombia. Then I am just getting a little bit of knowledge regarding India. It's a very interesting topic for me. Professor Mitra, two questions. The first one, taking into account India and China relations, and also considering that making agreements is not so easy, do you think that the international environment is helpful to construct India and China relations peacefully, or there are other interests, values, etc., that maybe can be exerting pressure against India and China in order to not have agreements in topics like economics, technology, security, etc.? That's the first question. The second question, as a comparativist that you are, and considering that you have observed India in a comparative perspective, in your perception, the process of the democratization in India can teach us something about how to construct better democracies or different democracies in the global south? The question to summarize is what we can learn from the Indian process in order to solve conflicts in a democratic way the best as possible. And many thanks again, Professor Mitra, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Nicholas. Professor, you have the floor.
Okay. First of all, recently when Xi Jinping went to meet Biden, the two sort of had a walkabout, and I was looking at that picture of the two walking nicely together and asking myself, that's it. Now India is going to be cut out of the equation altogether. Because so far, India has been playing the role of a pivot. Pivot is one which can tip it this way or that way to make this side or that side win. So the Americans have roped India in to be part of the Quad and to work with Australia and Japan, America and China, India together in a kind of anti-China coalition to securitize Southeast Asia. But on the other hand, India does not join the United States on the sanction against Russia or on Ukraine. So India has been able to manage to keep that pivotal position. The question is this position sustainable indefinitely? Or in a different kind of world, will India lose the strategic autonomy altogether? That is a question which actually is for the diplomats present here to respond to. I'm only an amateur. I would argue that the possibility certainly exists that India might find herself high and dry if the United States and China made up. Only I would say that making up is a long way off because there are sticking points. Taiwan is not going to go away. Taiwan and the United States has a commitment to protect Taiwan, and the Chinese would want to complete their unification. So in that sense, India has a bit of time. But that's why I had built in the issue of India also talking about a two-state solution for China. And Chinese don't like it. And that might become a little bit of a leverage. And on that, India might find some support from the American side. No one is really talking about a two-state solution in China. People talk about a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine, but not China. So India might have a bit of leverage in terms of developing a different framework, which will probably give India some room to maneuver, probably. Otherwise, I would agree with Ambassador Rana, who said India has to settle her domestic issues, India has to build up her economy and her strength. And when that happens, India will not need the pivotal power to feel secure. India will feel more secure as India, not as a pivot necessarily. But the second question for me is a very, very important question because I have not thought about it, but now I will, now that you have asked this question. First of all, what does democracy mean in the Indian context? What does democracy mean in the Chinese context? In the Indian context, I've gone on and on. It's about food, clothing, shelter, about dignity, about identity, and so on, and how to give these things to people. And if they're getting it, then I would say they're happy with their form of democracy. How about then the argument of the Western powers that India's liberalism is slowly declining? What does liberalism mean in the Indian context? If it means rights, I see rights as entitlement, as welfare. So I would like to develop what is called a vernacular democracy or vernacular understanding of democracy. In India, it is known as hak or my right. And these rights are no longer gifts from above. When Modi says people below poverty level will get free rice, free wheat, it's not a charity, it's an entitlement. Now, some argue that it is ruining the market economy of India. But on the other hand, one could also argue that if these people have something to eat and feel comfortable, then they would be better workers, or they would have the means to go away and find jobs elsewhere. So that argument can go on. How about China? What I've seen in the Chinese village, around the table, there was an imam, a Muslim man, there was a party man, and there was the village leader, rich man, but not a party member. And then there are some others, not older people, but also there are younger people hanging around. I did not find an oppressive totalitarian presence of the party there. Of course, there are things you cannot do. You just can't buy land. You have to apply. It's a controlled market that way. But I did not see the naked face of hunger like I have in my younger days in Odisha, or telltale signs, people going barefoot. I have not seen a single beggar in that village. So there is a kind of Chinese vernacular understanding, or as my Chinese friends say, our democracy comes to us through our mouth. We get a standard of living. Elections, do they have free and fair elections like in India? Well, there's a kind of co-opting mechanism where those who matter go up and they have their own form of power struggles. I wouldn't say one is necessarily better than the other, which, for forms of government, let full struggle, or that's how it goes. What is best administered is the best. Is there law and order? Does the economy work? Is there a mechanism for regulation? I would, rather than developing a kind of global ranking mechanism or ranking methods of measurement, I would say, let us reimagine democracy internally or in terms of vernacular. And this vernacularization of democracy is what India should learn from China, China should learn from India, and develop their own democracy according to their own measuring systems. In India, there are cases of lynching for cow, but immediately someone acts somewhere. So it's not that Indian democracy is perfect, but it has found a method of self-correction, course correction. Every election brings in new issues. That's a form of course correction. Is that going on, or is the political system stagnating? These are issues that I would submit as things that we learn from one another comparatively. My last point would be, why must we always compare ourselves to 19th century England or contemporary United States? Why should we not look at our own neighbors, look at the Asian states to think of Asian cultures? Why should our measurements be only built in London or Washington? They're also built in Beijing. We should open up the parameters of comparison.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. It's been a fascinating afternoon. I would like to thank all of the participants for having been present here, for giving a supportive audience to Professor Mitra's lecture. May I now, with your permission, Professor, hand over back to Kashish from the ICS to complete our proceedings for today. Kashish, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, sir. But we also have another question in the chat box. So if I have your permission, can I read that out to Professor Mitra, or?
Yes, you can, provided you have the time for the Zoom session, because the technology sometimes delinks itself automatically.
Yes, sir. So if we can just quickly go through the question, Professor Mitra, can I please relay the question to you now?
Yes, please.
Yes, so the question is from Marcus Pauly, and he is asking you to please elaborate on the perspective for the strategic partnership between the EU and India regarding the long in the making free trade agreement and other areas of cooperation like technology.
Well, one of my answers would be to look up the book that we have written together along with Marcus Pauly, but this is an area where we're doing more research, and I'm grateful to Marcus for articulating this question, because this research project is being made now from Dublin, and we have to think about what is the room to maneuver that India has within the EU, and what kind of products India can export. And I've always worried about India's agricultural products, which in the old days, the quotas were given. India did not have the quotas. So that is one area to negotiate. A second area to negotiate is the possibility of sending skilled and unskilled labor from India to the EU countries. I know that some Latin American countries have special deals. Like I've recently seen Brazil having such an arrangement with the EU, and also Colombia sending learning German and then sending them to Germany, and that kind of export of manpower I've not seen between India and EU countries. Maybe India could learn from what others are doing and negotiate that with the EU centrally and individual European countries, probably particularly. anyway, it's a new area for me. There's a lot more there to explore. Thank you.
Thank you. Kashish?
So now I would like to seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session. Right.
Yes.
So with this, we would like to wrap up the session, and we thank Professor Subrata K. Mitra and Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee for giving us their precious time and gracing the seminar with their valuable insights. We would also like to thank all the participants who engaged in this dialogue. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS YouTube platform. Information related to the Wednesday seminar will be available on the ICS website, or you can also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.